All right, Shavuos, say good morning. Today's daf is Kufhei, beautiful daf ahead of us today, 105. We are picking up on the second line on Kufhei 105. Our shir this morning is dedicated by Paul Pollack in memory of his beloved sister Linda Pollack, in the memory of his beloved aunt Esther Pollack, Esther Bas Zechariah. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, their neshamas will have an aliyah. Amen. I also want to thank Yehuda for giving this shir yesterday. I apologize. Unfortunately, we had a levaya, but I left you in very, very good hands. So let's begin. So what was I? So second line, Kuf Hey Amud Beis. I'm sorry, Kuf Hey Amud Aleph. Hayman, the Kabbalah Iska. So let's remember again, we saw in yesterday's daf, we got a little bit back to the Iska arrangements. So without delving all the way back into all of the details of Iska, we'll analyze these cases. Hayman, the Kabbalah Iska Min Chabri. So let's remember again, on the most basic level, Iska refers to merchandise. So one individual received merchandise from his friend. Upasid v'tarach umayis. Remember, we're talking over here about partnership agreements. So one individual received merchandise from his friend with which to conduct business. He suffered a loss. Well, so let's call Reuben and Shimon. So Shimon receives merchandise from Reuben with which to conduct business. Shimon suffers a loss. Utarach umalye. He worked hard, and he recouped the loss. Below Odai. But again, we'll say during this entire time, so Shimon never told Reuven, who essentially is the cash partner or the merchandise partner, never told him about the loss. So what happened? Amarle, so the Gemara said, Lo matzi Amarle, Dare mehach psida b'hadai. So we'll say, so at the time when they divide up the profits or divide up the monies, so Shimon, we'll call him the working partner, cannot go over to Reuven, we'll call him the merchandise or capital partner, and say to him, listen, I never told you about this, but I had this loss. We should really split that loss evenly. Now remember again, Shimon never told Reuben about that loss at the time of the loss, because he's telling him now at the time that they're dividing up the funds. So Shimon can tell Reuben, we should really divide up that loss. Because again, I will say, Reuben could say back to Shimon, listen, that's why you worked hard to go ahead and rebound from that loss. In order that they should not call you the loser of merchandise. So what Reuven says to Shimon is, no. Had you perhaps told me about this in the beginning, we could have discussed, now that you're coming back to me at the end, and you've recaptured those losses, we're not going to share the loss, because we both know the reason you didn't tell me about this in the beginning was why? Because it would damage your ability to engage in future business opportunities if people saw that you cannot properly manage merchandise. This is actually a very interesting case. Two individuals, Reuben and Shimon, enter into an Iska agreement together, an Iska partnership, a merchandise agreement. And what happens? Baruch Hashem, they do well. Now, both say, now just to give you the context, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. It's Rashi almost right across a few lines down. Rashi says, Beitrei David Iska Bahadi Adadi V'Ravach Shnei Kablonim Shekiblu Iska Mi Balabayis. So we'll say in this case over here, you have two individuals who are going ahead and receiving merchandise from a third party, and they're working together. Shem Guru. So we'll say, so Reuben and Shimon receive merchandise from a third party, and it's their job to sell the merchandise. V'isach Rubamos, and after they sell the merchandise, so their charge is to go ahead and do business with the funds. Ad Zman Ploni. And Rabbi say there is a duration for this business arrangement. So what happens? So listen to this. Reuben and Shimon receive merchandise from a third party. And the goal over here is to do business with the merchandise, sell off the merchandise that's at a profit, invest the money in whatever, and the duration of this agreement is 1 year. And after 1 year, we're going to split the money 3 ways between Reuben and Shimon, and between, again, we'll call him the merchandise partner. Fine. So what happens? They profit 6 months in, So what happens? Reuben says to Shimon, let's dissolve the partnership now. Meaning we're up, let's dissolve the partnership now. So the Gemara says the following, So we'll say, and Shimon says, no. Shimon says, no, that's not the duration of the partnership. The partnership is to last for a year. So let's take our time. Meaning, again, we've profited after 6 months. We could profit in another 6 months. Let's leave the partnership as is. So the halacha is dinuhu d'ma'akev. So we'll say Shimon has the right to prevent Reuven from dissolving the partnership. Because we'll say, since the partnership was founded not only with a specific business direction, but with what? With a duration, with a time frame, so one partner cannot prematurely dissolve the partnership over the objections of the other. Again, obviously we'll say, if everybody agrees, everybody agrees, but Lamaisa, one can't do it without the consent of the other. V'i amrle, havli palga d'ravcha. So we'll say, so let's say, Reuven says to Shimon, fine, you don't want to dissolve the partnerships, that's fine, but I want to cash out my share of the profits now. Amrle, ravcha lakarna mishtabit. Shimon, the other partner, could say no, because your profits are tethered to the principal. And since the principal is still going to be used because the partnership is still an agreement, you cannot cash out on your profits. So Reuven says, fine, I'll take my half of the profits and my half of the principal. To which ultimately, again, Reuven could say to Shimon, no, because why? Because, again, the iska, the merchandise, meaning this entire transaction, ultimately is tethered to your principal and your profits. V'i amarle niflag ravcha v'niflag karna v'mati lecha pseida darina b'hadachna. Listen to this. Now Reuven clearly really wants to get out of this partnership. So what he says is, give me my principal, give me my profits, and should you suffer any losses, I will make you whole. Okay? So amarle, listen to this. So says Shimon could still say no. Mazlo debate trey adif. The mazel of two people is better than the mazel of one person. Which I will say is a very simple way of saying that once you're in it, you're in it. Once there's a partnership agreement that is of a defined scope for a defined amount of time, obviously if both partners agree on the dissolution, of course that is permitted. But should one of the partners say, I don't want out, again, he has every right to block the other from leaving, because again, what the Gemara is clearly saying is the removal of one of the partner's interests from the partnership interest. And we'll say, here's the interesting part. Even if we'll call him the departing partner, it doesn't sounds ominous, right? But the departing partner, even if he offers to go ahead and shield the remaining partner from losses, he still can't pull out. Okay, interesting halacha. Well, say obviously these laws of dissolving partnerships are a bit more intricate, but again, at least this gives you an overarching framework. Says the Mishnah, Hamikabel sada mechavero. So we'll say again, I go ahead and I receive a field from my friend. Now, we'll say, so we're going to see what the context over here is in just a moment. So what happens? I don't feel like weeding the field. I don't want to weed it. I don't want to remove the field. And I say, let's say I'm getting the field from Reuven. I say to Reuven, Reuven, what does it matter to you if I don't weed the field? So remember, we'll say this is a case of chachirus, where we saw arisos and chachirus. The difference between them is an aris pays a percentage of the crop, a chocher pays a fixed amount. So I say to Reuven, this is a chachirus situation. Whichever, I don't know the English, which I guess an aris is a sharecropper. I think they call a chocher a tenant farmer. The point over here is I say to Reuven, look, at the end of the day, you're going to get your money, right? I agree to pay you X. I'm going to pay you X. I don't feel like weeding the field. They're both saying the Metziah as to why doesn't make any difference. The point over here in this case is I'm saying I am responsible to pay you the money, but I don't feel like paying the field. So what's talacha? I'm sorry, I don't feel like weeding the field. What's talacha? Ain't shomana. So we'll say in this case, we do not listen to me. In other words, me, the chocher, and I have to weed the field. Because Reuven could say to me, tomorrow you're going to leave. And what's going to happen? The field is going to be producing weeds. Okay. So we'll say, we'll try to understand exactly what Reuven, the landowner's time is. But point over here is what is the Mishnah trying to teach me? The Mishnah trying to teach me that I will say, even if I am willing to pay the money, paying the money is only part of it. I have an obligation of field upkeep as well. So in other words, I can't say to the owner of the field, listen, mind your own business. when I'm the chocher, this field is mine. I can do with it as I please. And as long as you're getting paid, you have no right to say anything. Kamash Malon, no. The Mishnah says that the tenant farmer has an absolute obligation to weed the field as well. Says the Gemara, I amarle lebasar hachi karivnale. Shavuos says, so what happens if I say the following? I say to Ruvain, I will weed the field before I give it back to you. Look at Rashi for just a moment. It's the last two short lines in Rashi. The Amarle Karivna, Hashta Mefarish Amayin Shomelo. I Amar Lo Ani Achrosh Achar HaKatzira, Va'afoch Shrashi Asavim Shenos Ruba, V'amusulo Salafanecha Savim Mai Mahadule. So let's say again, what would happen if I go ahead and the Chochar, say to Ruvain, listen, here's the deal. I'm not weeding it now for a whole variety of reasons, but here's what I agree to. Before I return the field to you, I will weed it. So I'm not weeding, whatever the reason I will say, again, like I said, the Metziah doesn't matter, but I will give you back the field in a weeded state. I'll give you back a weeded field. So the Amar Lei, so the owner has the right to say, no, I don't accept that, because Chiti Ma'al Yasa Ba'ina. I want top grade wheat. In other words, both say, in this case, if you remember, even in a chocher is still often paying with produce, right? And again, just the difference is it's often a fixed amount of produce as opposed to an aris who pays with a percentage. So the owner of the land could say, if you don't weed, the quality of the wheat is not as high. I want high quality wheat, and therefore again you have to weed. The Amarle Zabnina Lacha Chiti Mishuka. Supposed to listen to this. So really, some people just want to avoid weeding at all costs. So what happens? So I say to the owner of the field, listen, all right, you want good wheat? Here's the agreement. I'll buy you good wheat from the marketplace. So you don't mean I will pay you your chachiros, not even from the produce of the field. I'll pay it to you ultimately again from the marketplace. I'll buy you highest quality wheat. Also listen to this. Amalei chiti da'arai ba'ina. To which the landowner could say, no. I want my wheat. In other words, I want wheat from my field. The Amalei menachishna l'chashir manseich. So I say to him, I the choker, say to Reuben the landowner, fine. You know what I'll do? I'll weed the area necessary to produce the amount of wheat that you are entitled to. Whereas I'm not weeding the whole field, but I'll weed the portion necessary to produce the wheat that you're entitled to. So therefore, again, you can get high quality wheat from your own field. Amarle kamenaspis shemra la'aroi. No, because you're going to create a bad reputation for my land. Those are both like what Reuben could say, which makes a lot of sense. When people walk by my field and they see it overgrown with weeds, then what does it look like? What does it look like? So I say, so it looks like, understand, we think it looks messy, it doesn't look nice. This is not just a din in messiness. This is a din in lack of fertility, right? Meaning, why is that field overgrown like that? Why isn't it producing crop? So at the end of the day, now Reuven says, now you're really drilling down to what it is. Reuven's concerned that what this does is, should I ever try to sell this piece of property in the future, I'm going to have difficulty selling it at full market value, because at the end of the day, people will remember it as the field with weeds, will assume it's not productive, that drives down the price. But we learned Rabbi say, but that's not what the Mishnah said. Because remember the exchange in the Mishnah? The exchange in the Mishnah is, I say to Reuven, listen, I'm not weeding, but don't worry about it, I'm still going to give you your full price. So Reuven, the owner of the land, could say, no, you have to weed the field, because otherwise it will constantly sprout weeds. What does that mean? Ela mishum da'amarle bizra dinafal nafal. Which will say literally means that once a weed seed falls, it falls. So apparently, we'll say once you allow weeds to grow in a field, so again, it's not necessarily the pshat that once you uproot all the current weeds that the weeds are gone. Apparently, seeds sometimes could fall into the field as well from the weeds, and the weeds could become an ongoing issue. Therefore, we'll say, and this is indeed the halacha l'maisa. Therefore, again, even in this case where I, the chocher, agreed to give the farmer his particular portion, and again, whether I weed or not, the halacha is he could force me to have to weed because it's in the best interest of his field in order to avoid an ongoing weed problem, that the field is weeded in a timely fashion. Good. Mishnah. This is actually a very interesting case. So I go ahead And again, we'll discuss the context over here, and we'll discuss the context in just a moment in terms of what the nature of the rental agreement is. So I go ahead and I receive a field from Ruvain. Follow Asasav. So we'll say, so listen to this. The field is not producing the amount of produce that I had expected, that I, the tenant farmer, had expected. So we'll say, let's look at Rashi for just a moment. It's the first Rashi in the Mishnah. In the wide lines, it's 2, 4, 6 lines down in the wide lines, right by the Mishnah. So listen to this. Rashi says, Tvua ela ma'at. This is actually a very interesting case. I entered into this agreement with the field, expecting the field to produce X. The field is not producing X. It's only producing Y. So listen to this. So I, the tenant farmer, come over to him and say, listen, you know what, the field is not producing. I did everything I'm supposed to do. The field is not producing. And Rabbi said, at a certain point in time, I, the tenant farmer, do my cost-benefit analysis, and I decide this field is not worth my time. It's not worth my time, meaning the amount of effort necessary to put in does not match the amount of output. So I go over to them and I say, essentially, I'm not working this field anymore. So it says the Gemara. So the shayla the Mishnah is trying to deal with over here now is, what is the minimal amount of crop output that a field has to be producing in order that a tenant farmer is obligated to comply with the details of the agreement? So it says the Mishnah, it's actually interesting, and we'll discuss this. If the field produces enough produce, that ultimately, again, it can produce a kri. We'll say kri means a pile. If it's fertile enough that it could produce a pile of produce, then chayav l'tapaba. The tenant farmer is in fact obligated to go ahead and continue to work it. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, my kitzva b'kri. Rabbi Yehuda says, what does that mean? What does that mean, a pile? First of all, so Rabbi Yehuda is bothered by what an amorphous statement. If it produces a pile of produce, how big is a pile? Big pile, small pile, wide pile, small pile? What is that? Rather, Rabbi Yehuda gives an objective metric. He says, Ella im yeshba kedei nefila. And this is very interesting. Rabbi Yehuda says, in order for a tenant to be bound, to continue working the field has to produce at least what he calls kedei nefila. Now look at Rashi again. This time it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up. 9 lines up. Let's say, I think I mentioned this to you before, just quickly. Baruch Hashem, we're so spoiled. We have Rashi with highlighted, Divrei Hamas. I remember my grandfather, Zechron Levracha, who was a Talmud of Nirvana. When I remember these Gemaras, like the Talmud Gemaras, first came out with the highlighted Rashis, he was very upset. He said, what's going to happen to Mesiras Nefesh and Torah if people don't even have to search for a Rashi? So the good news is we still have to search for Rashi. Baruch Hashem, the Mesiras Nefesh is not gone. So this is 9 lines up from the bottom in Rashi. He says, so the Rashi says, Ila im yeshba kedei nefila. So Rashi says, Sheyachol lachzor ulezora l'shana haba mitvuas shana zu. So Rabbi Yehuda said that in order to go ahead and for the tenant farmer to be bound to continue to produce the produce, to continue to work the field, the field has to produce at least enough produce to sow the field for next year's crop. That's Lashon, we'll say, Kedei Nefila means the amount of seed that you would need to drop along the field in order for the field to be replanted for the subsequent year. So essentially, what is Rabbi Yehuda saying? It's an interesting yesod. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, as long as the crop is self-perpetuating, in other words, as long as there's enough crop to be able to go ahead and plant for next year also, even though the output is not what you had expected, nevertheless, you have to continue to work the field. So Rashi says over here, Nefila, Zeresh Shemefazim Mapalas Yad, on a seed that you spread with your hand. We'll say, again, you'll keep this in mind because the Gemara is going to use this same Lashon in just a little bit in a different context. So it says the Gemara. We'll say, now let's analyze this halacha. Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. It's good to see you. Tan Rabbanan. HaMekabel Sada Mechavero. So what happens? A person receives the fields from his friend, below asasa, and again the field did not go ahead and yield its predicted output. Im yeshba kedei lahamid kri chayav l'tapel ba. If the field is going to produce a pile, then the tenant farmer is obligated to continue to work the field. And I will say, so the Gemara is wondering, where do you get this pile from? In other words, where does that amount, or where does that shear, even though it's not really a shear, but where does that concept come from? To which Gemara says, I'll tell you where it comes from. Shekach kosevel, because I will say, this was the lashon often in tenant-farmer agreements. What was the lashon? Shekach kosevel, ana. I referring to the tenant farmer, Shekach Kasav, Ana Okim Va'anir Ve'ezra Va'achsor, I will go ahead and uphold and plow and sow and reap the field. Ve'omer, I will pile the produce. Va'adosh, I will thresh. Ve'idri Va'okim Karya Kadamach, and I will create a pile of produce before you. V'tisi ant, v'tito palga, you will come along and take your half. Va'ana ba'amoli ubinafkus yadi palga, and me, for my toil, for my expenses, will take, and for my profit, will take my half. So we'll say, what the Gemara's point is very interesting. Where does the Mishnah get the kri? Where does the Mishnah get the pile amount from? Because apparently, that was standard lashon, that was standard wording in tenant-farmer agreements. So apparently, again, in agricultural societies, that must have been a known amount. The kri must have been some type of basic unit of produce. Uvekama, so how much is a kri? Vekama kadei lahamid bakri. So how much is it? How much is it? Right? It's bothersome, right? Everybody's agitated about this. Again, so I understand that's the lashon, but how much is it? Remember again, we're learning halacha over here. This is Gemara's halacha. It's all about shiurim. It's all about quantifying amounts. You keep telling me, kri, driving me crazy. How much is it? So it says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yossi Arichanina, kadei shatamod ba harachas. Is interestingly enough. In order to go ahead, it has to be tall enough and deep enough that you could put, so this is, rachas is literally the winnowing shovel. So what happens, or winnowing fork. So what would happen is, remember again, how do you winnow wheat? So you go ahead, this was a normal Sunday activity, right? You go ahead, you take the wheat, right? And you throw it up in the air, and the wind separates the wheat and the chaff. So that utensil that's used for the winnowing is called a rachas. So it says the Gemara, a kri is a large enough pile of produce that when you put the rachas in there, the rachas cannot be seen. Not the handle, but the bottom of it. That's the size of a kri. What happens if you could put the winnowing instrument into the pile, but the sides of the instrument extend from the pile? So is that considered to be a large enough pile or not? So Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina said that the kones is literally the scooper part, right? It's the actual receptacle part of the utensil, cannot see the face of the sun. What Shavuos says is another way of saying that the scooper, right, the winnowing tool, or I should say differently, that the pile of produce has to be tall enough, deep enough, that ultimately when you insert the winnowing tool into it, it cannot be seen at all. Itmar. Levi Amar Shalosh Seim. So I'll say, so now we're going to try to quantify this just a little bit more. So Levi comes along and says the amount of produce that a field needs to produce in order for a tenant farmer to be bound to continue to work it is 3 sa'ah. Tebei Rabbi Yanai Amar Amri Sasayim. So in the Shiv Rabbi Yanai they said 2 sa'ah. Amar Reish Lakish Sasayim Sha'amru Chutz Min Ha'utzah. And Reish Lakish comes along and says, by the way, when we say 2 sa'ah, that's 2 sa'ah, we'll say above and beyond any expenses. Tanan Hassam. So we're going to go back to a little bit. We'll say the common discussion over here is talking about situations where the field is just not producing in accordance with expectations. And we're trying to figure out, again, is there ever a time where a tenant farmer could say, I'm out, because this is not worth the effort. It's not worth the effort. So that's what we're trying to figure out. What is the most basic amount of output that binds a tenant farmer to continue this relationship? So Tzan Lasam, what do we learn there? Pritze Zaysim. Va'anavim. This is actually interesting lesson over here. So Pritze Zaysim, if you look at Rashi, this is now 5 lines after the bottom of Rashi, last 3 words on the line. Pritze Zaysim, Kedim Mefaresh, Rishai Zaysim Va'anavim. Evil olives and grapes. Now, what makes olives and grapes evil? So he says, "Sheli olam boser she'ein bishulan nigmar li olam." Both said they are always underdeveloped; they never mature. Both said we should understand the incredible hashkafa on this. You know what rishus is? real rishos. What makes a rasha? It's not that he commits averos, right? Because even tzaddikim commit averos. So what makes a rasha? A lack of desire to grow. When you always just remain in place and you never develop, you never grow, you never push yourself to become more, that's rishos. That's evil. So here we have the Pritzei Zeisim va'anavim. The evil grapes and olives are the ones that never mature. They never grow up. They just simply remain in place. They never expand their horizons. They never desire to become more. They are who they are. And even though, again, they taste sour, and even though they're unpleasant, and even though they could be so much better, so much sweeter, they refuse to go ahead and move anywhere. So says the Gemara. They're not awesome. Pritzei zeisim va'anavim. Beishamai metamin, or beisila metaren. So we'll say, so now the shaila becomes, what's the nature ultimately again of these grapes? Are these grapes considered to be ochel, not considered to be ochel? So Beishamai says, metamin. Beishamai says they have the ability to go ahead and contract tumas ochlin, the type of tuma that only food items could contract, because even though, again, they are not yet fully developed, nevertheless they're still considered food. Beisil matarin. Beisil says, no, look at Rashi again, matarin in tumas ochlim v'lo chazi lachila. Because they're not really fit for consumption, therefore they're not subject to the laws of tumas ochlim. So says the Gemara, my pritzei zeisim, what is this lashon of pritzei zeisim? Amar Rav Huna rishai zeisim. So it means wicked olives. Amar Rav Yosef umaykra. What's the pasuk that teaches us that the lashon of pritzi is a lashon of evil? So the Gemara over here quotes in the pasuk in Daniel. So ubnei pritzi amcha yenasu lahamid chazon v'nechshalu. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Armehacha quotes here from the pasuk from Yechezkel v'holid ben paritz shofech dam v'asa'ach me'achar me'ela. So we'll say, so you see over here that the lashon ultimately again of paritz is used in the context of evildoers. Rabbi Lazar Amar arba'os kabin lakura. So we'll say Rabbi Lazar comes along and says, again, we'll say now back to our previously established discussion. Rashi says arba'os kabin lakura shemachlisim beis habad mehen kedei shir ti'inas hakora bepam achas ve'in motzin ala arba kabin shemen. So we'll say in terms of olives, what's the minimal amount that an olive field has to produce in order for a tenant farmer to be bound to keep working it? As long as it produces 4 kav of oil every time the olives are pressed. Apparently, whatever the amount was, there was a established amount of olives that you would put in the press at once. So 4 kav, apparently, to come out of a pressing of olives is a relatively small amount of oil. But even if all you're getting is that amount of oil, the tenant farmer would have to continue working the field. In Yeshua Rabbi they said, even if you're only getting 2 core of oil out of the press, v'lo pligi, and they're not really arguing, haba asra demaili kura ba'olallah, haba asra demaili tlasa kurin ba'olallah. Everything depends on how much olives you are actually putting into the press. The first case was talking about a situation where you only put a mound of olives, and the other amount was talking about a place where they used to put 3 core of olives. Fine. Ten Rabbanim. Both say again, just to understand, it's the same discussion. Just trying to figure out what is the minimal field output that binds a tenant farmer to continue his tenancy on the field. Tan Rabbanan, Amud Beis. Alu bi'ilan. Both say, now this is an interesting discussion over here. Alu bi'ilan shekocho ra. Both say, okay, we're switching gears just a little bit for a moment. Now, who's Alu? Watch this. Look at Rashi. Alu. Zav vitar. So both say, we know a Zav is a man who has some type of emission that renders him tameh. Now, the interesting part about a Zav is the following. If a Zav touches someone, right, even out with his hand, just through contact, I rub shoulders with a Zav, I become Tameh as well. So we're talking about over here the following. Alu bi'ilan shekocho ra. I go up with the Zav on a tree that's weak. Or besocha shekocho ra. Or ultimately, I go on a branch with a Zav that's weak. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Alu, Zav vitar li'ilan shekocho ra. So a Zav and a person who's tar, I'm the tar person, I go up with the Zav on the tree that's weak. Or we go up on a branch that's weak. What's the halacha? Tame. So we'll say, I am Tame. Why am I Tame? Look at Rashi. Tame. Hatar shekevan sha'ilan ohasocha kochara nichvefes tachteyen. The kavad ha'alyon al tachton v'nishon amikach sha'alyon ubein zav shenishon al atar be'tar shenishon al zav Tame. Because what's going to happen? If we go up on a weakened tree, or we go up ultimately again on a branch, what's going to happen? It's going to bend. It's going to bend. And ultimately again, I'm going to end up touching the zav. So says the Gemara the following. And what ends up happening over here is because the bending of that tree happens because of our joint kochos, therefore ultimately again I become tummy as a result of contact with the zav. So says the Gemara, Hechidami, what's the case? Hechidami ilan shekochora. What's the case of a weak tree? Amri debei Rav Yanai, kol she'ein bi'ikaran lochok rova. It's any tree that is not thick enough, Rabbi say, at its trunk to be able to take a quarter, right? Literally, shem l'chok rova. In order to look at Rashi, shem b'kar l'chok berach rova akav. Any tree whose trunk is not thick enough to be able to extract a quarter of a kav of wood from its trunk. What's the case of a branch that is weak? Any branch that is so thin that when I place my hands around it, the branch cannot be seen. So Tanan Hasan, we learned there. Let's stop for a moment. Beis hapras. We've actually learned about this before. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Hamahalich bebeis hapras. Rashi says, Soda shenechrash bakever. So we'll say beis hapras is a field that I know there was a grave in this field. I know there was a grave, an unmarked grave. And what happens? The field was plowed. So the concern now is for bone fragments in that field. Now the halacha is that a etzem kisaora, a bone fragment, even the size of a barley kernel, could go ahead and convey tumah through maga, through direct contact. So that's the concern over here. Rashi says, Sadish nechrash ba'kever, chashu la'etzem kisaora shem tami b'maga v'masa, ve'inu matami ba'ohel. Now here's the interesting part. As much as by tumas meis, there is a concept of tumas ohel, that if somebody goes ahead and even hovers over a corpse, I form a roof over the corpse, I become tamei. That only applies with a mace itself. When it comes to bone fragments that are small are only matami through direct contact. So watch this case. So it says the Gemara. So Tanan Hasan, Hamahalech bebeis hapras agabe avadim shachal hasid. I'm walking in this field that had a grave, and the grave was plowed over. So there's the potential for bone fragments. Now I'm walking on top of stones, shiyachal hasid. So let's say there's a stone walk, right? But the stones move. They're not firmly embedded in the ground. Then what's the halacha? Shiyachal hasid, or al ha'adam, or I'm riding on top of a person. Va'ala behema, or on top of an animal, shekochan ra, who are weak. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Tameh. Here's what's interesting. Now, in all of these cases, I will be tameh. What's the logic behind that? The logic behind it, Rabbi say, seems to be that halacha lemaisa, because the stones move. When I move, if there's a bone fragment under the stone, therefore when I move the stone, the bone fragment moves. It's considered as if I have moved the fragment. Similarly, again, if I'm riding on top of a person who is weak, or on top of an animal that is weak, and therefore again it's buckling, we'll see, it's buckling under my weight. So then if that person moves the bone fragment, then ultimately it's considered as if I've moved it as well, and therefore I'll be tummy in all of these cases. To which the Gemara says, we'll say, how can you tell if the person is weak? Nokshos. I'll say anytime if I'm riding on top of the person and his knees are knocking together. I just says another way of saying his knees are buckling. If his knees are shaking, then that indicates that he can't really support my weight. If he can't really support my weight, then Rabosai, when he steps on the bone fragment and moves the bone fragment, it's as if I've moved the fragment as well, and therefore I'm tameh. How can you tell ultimately again if the animal is weak? If any time I get on the animal automatically excretes its waste. Which also says, no, saying that because of the pressure, the animal is excreting its waste. Therefore, again, that's also as if, again, the animal is too weak to support my weight. Which also means, if it's too weak to support my weight, that means that my weight is having an impact on its every step. and because of that, it's as if I have moved the bone fragment that the animal moves with its foot, and therefore I'm going to be tamei. Amri Dvei Rabbi Yanai, l'tfila u l'tfilin daled kavin. So we'll say another interesting halacha. For both davening as well as for tefillin, daled kavin. 4 kav is the measure. So it says the Gemara, look at Rashi, arba kavin is havishir masui. 4 kav is the amount that constitutes a burden. So says the Gemara, what are you talking about? L'tfila mahi. What are you talking about for tefillin? Well, so it's actually a very important halacha. Tisanyo hanose masui al kseifo. If a person goes ahead and is carrying a load on his shoulder, v'yigiyah zman tefillah, he has to daven shmona esrei. Pachos midaled kavin. If the load is less than 4 kav, then mafshilin la'achorav umispalel. In other words, if the load is relatively light, then what? I could just fling it over my back, and I could daven like that. Why? Because if the load is light, the assumption is what Rabbi was saying, that it will not interfere with my kavanah. However, arba kavin maniach al gabi karka u'mispalel. But again, if the load is 4 kav or more, then I have to put down the load because it will interfere, bless you, with my tefillin. I will say, this is a very important halacha, because what this says is, during davening, you are not permitted to be holding something that will distract you. Now again, just so you should know, this halacha actually applies even to things whose weight is relatively little, right? Like cell phone, right? This applies to anything ultimately, again, that is distracting over the course of tefillah. You are not ready. And also, like Mishnah Berurah brings down even that according to some, even holding svarim, right? Even holding a sefer at the time that tefillah over here, of course, in this context, refers to Shemona Esrei. But the idea over here is I can't hold on to anything that by definition will distract my tefillah. Now again, the Gemara over here is talking about in terms of weight, but the truth is, Mishnah Berurah brings down contemporarily that even things that are not a weight issue could still be a distraction issue. The tefillin mahi, what's the halacha with tefillin? Desanya hayanose masay al rosho utefillin barosho. Let's say if I was carrying a load on my head and I had my tefillin shel rosh on as well. Im hayu tefillin rotisos. If my tefillin are getting crushed underneath the bundle, then asr. Then I will say it is asr to go ahead and keep the tefillin on while I'm carrying the bundle. Ve'im lav mutter. But I will say if the load is not crushing the tefillin, then ultimately again I'm allowed to continue to wear the shalosh. But I will say obviously the Gemara is talking from a context where people wore tefillin all day long. So we'll say what type of load ultimately again poses a problem would be too heavy for the tefillin shalosh. Shel arba'as kavin. We're talking about a load ultimately again that is 4 kav at least in weight. Tani Rabbi Chia, let's listen to this case. Hamotzi zevel al rosho. Let's say somebody is carrying dung. Somebody is carrying fertilizer on their head. So I'm carrying fertilizer on my head, which would also, again, remember, this is a normal way to transport things on your head, but my tefillin shalosh is there as well. What's the halacha? So we'll say, so obviously to have my tefillin shalosh underneath the load of fertilizer, obviously is not appropriate. So what do? So we'll say, so again, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to move my shalosh to the side, because that would be the wrong placement for the shalosh. So what should I do? Nor should I tie my shalosh around my waist, because that's also not bakavadik. Rather, what should I do? Elo koshram al zroo b'makom tefillin. Well, this is actually an interesting halacha. So what does the Gemara tell me to do? I should tie my shalosh next to my shal yad. Since again, because we'll see the assumption over here is I'm still wearing my tefillin shal yad, so I should just tie my shalosh along the same hand, the same arm, right by my tefillin shal yad. Interesting halacha. So Mishun V'Rei Shila Amru afilu mitpachas shalahen asra lahaniach al harosh sheyesh ba tefillin. So we'll say in the Yeshiva Rabbi Shila they said you can't even put your tefillin bag on your head at the time when you are wearing your shalosh. Look at Rashi. Afilu mitpachas. It's actually right across in Rashi. Afilu mitpachas shalahen shekarchem ba tefillin balayla asar lahaniach l'shem amasei al harosh b'shash atzim l'kol nachon. You can't even wear the tefillin bag on your head at the time that you are wearing your shalosh, because it would constitute carrying a load. To which the Gemara says v'kama, and about say how much is considered to be a masui. Amrabaya afilu riva de pompadisa. even the quarter of a litra of pumbadis. In other words, even a relatively small amount would ultimately go ahead and constitute a masui, a burden on one's head at the time that they're wearing a tefillin shorosh. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda, my kids sabikri. Elaim yesh bo kedei nefila. So also going back to the Mishnah. So remember again, topic of our Mishnah was what is the minimum output of a field that still obligates the tenant farmer to continue going ahead and working the field. So remember, the first opinion the Mishnah said, a pile. So okay, we pretty much defined what is a pile. Rabbi Yehuda came along and said, no, in order to be bound to continue working the field has to produce enough seed, what we'll call, for self-perpetuation. So what we call kedei nefila, that the field produces enough seed to be able to continue to self-perpetuate seeding the field. So it says the Gemara, v'kama kedei nefila, how much is this amount of kedei nefila, meaning how much seed are we talking about? It means dalit sa'ah, 4 sa'ah of grain, in a field that normally produces a core. In other words, suppose I say I need 4 sa'ah of seed in a field that is normally capable of producing a core of wheat. Rabbi Ami Dilei Amar, Shmonas Se'in Lakor. Rabbi Ami himself said you need 8 sa'ah for a field that produces a core of wheat. In other words, remember again, you don't need the same amount of seed to produce the same amount of produce. So again, Rabbi Yochanan is saying 4 sa'ah of seed for a field that produces a core. Rabbi Ami is saying 8 sa'ah of seed for a field that produces a core. So a certain elder said to Rav Chama Drei Rabba Baravua, I'm explaining this to you, they're actually not arguing. Rather, Bishani Rabbi Yochanan Havish Shmeina Ara, Bishani Rabbi Ami Havikach Ara. Both in the days of Rabbi Yochanan, the soil was very fertile. Therefore, you needed less seed in order to produce a core of wheat. And in the years of Rabbi Ami, the fields were not as fertile, and therefore you needed more seed to get the same amount of wheat. Tanan Hasan will say, we learned over there, Haruach Shapizras Omrim. Will say, actually, this is a fascinating halacha, a truly riveting halacha. Listen to this. Haruach Shapizras Omrim. Will say, let's say the wind comes along and scatters the stalks of wheat. Now, what happened over here? Now, look at Rashi for just a moment. So, we'll say this is a cross in Rashi, 4 lines before Rashi gets wide. Haruach shepizras omrim besada v'kisu es haleket shalanim. So we'll say, so what happens? So remember again, leket. What's leket? I drop stalks of wheat. I drop stalks of wheat while I'm going ahead and harvesting my fields. What's the halach when you drop a stalk of wheat? You leave it alone. Now watch this. I had leket in my field. Get ready for this. A wind comes along and scatters my other stalks of wheat. So what happens, Abosai? This is very dramatic. What happens? The leket gets covered up. What's the problem now? What's the problem? I don't know what's leket and what's mine. What's leket and what's mine? So look at Rashi. So Aruach shepizras ha'omrim v'sada v'kisu es haleket shalamiyim hamafuzir b'sada. So the wind came along, scattered my stalks of wheat that I had collected, and spread them over the leket. Ve'eno yodua kama leket hayasham lamata mina omrim. And I don't know how much leket there was. So we'll say, now go back to the Gemara. So what happens? The Rosh Hashanah Omrim, Omdim Osa, Kama Leket Ru'uya La'asos, V'nosin La'aniyim. So this is interesting. So we assess how much leket would be normal for a field this size. So we'll say, so this is interesting. So there must have been some type of leket formula. Meaning it was understood when you were harvesting a field of this size, how many stalks on average would you normally drop? So again, there must have been some type of harvesting formula for this. So we go ahead, right? We run the numbers. We see how much leket you would have normally left behind in a field like this, and that's the amount you designate towards leket. So the Gemara says, Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer, no sein la'aniyim kedei nefila. Now I say, remember I told you before, kedei nefila in the Mishnah is different than this kedei nefila. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, we give to the aniyim the amount that would normally fall. So we'll say the kama kedei nefila. How much is kedei nefila? So look at Rashi for just a moment. Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer, first white line in Rashi. Ein hadavar tzarich omed kvar kotzuv kedei nefila va'omri v'nosei alim kedei nifo leket hakotzuv davar. So we'll say, so says Rav Shimon Gamliel is coming along to say the following. Rosh Hashanah is coming to say that there's an exact amount. The Kamakadei Nefila, Kiyasar Avdini Amr Abelazar Tir Rabbi Yochanan, Arba'as Kabin Lakor. It's 4 kav for every core. Right? Dalit kabin shaleket lechol kor. So we assume that there is 4 kabin of leket for every core of wheat produced. But Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, 1 second, what does that mean? Lekor zera or lekor tavua? Is that, Nabasan, listen to this. Is that 4 kav for every core of seeding, for every core of seeds, or for every core of two, for every core of prudence? In other words, we're both saying, what are we saying over here? Is that 4 kav of leket for every core of seed that is planted, or for every core of wheat that is produced? Lema poles yad, or lema poles shvarim. Furthermore, again, I will say, if you say that it's for every core of seed that is planted, is that seed that is planted by hand, or is that seed that is planted by animals? Also, there were 2 ways to see the field. One way to see the field is how? You know this. One way to see the field is you literally walk around with your bag of seeds, and what do? Spread it around, right? The other way you do it is you would load up like you know what it's like? It's like a spreader. You would load up like a spreader for the animals, and the animals would spread the seeds. Now, obviously, when the animals spread the seeds, there's a lot more seed that's necessary. So when we say, again, this amount of leket, is this for a person spreading it by hand or spreading it by animals? Tashma, let's just finish the Mishnah. Arba'as kabin lekor zera. Oh, so first of all, say what we were establishing is what? That the amount of established leket is 4 kav for every core of seed. But still we have to ask, is this seed that is being spread ultimately again by hand or by animals? To which the Gemara says, Tegu. That was we don't know. I want to tell you the incredible novelty over here. What's the incredible novelty? The incredible novelty is if I were to ask you to adjudicate the case, right? What's the halacha? What's the halacha? I have leket in my field, and then what? My stalks go ahead and blow onto the leket and obscure the leket. So I'll say, so what should if you're a purist, what should the halacha be? Right? What should the halacha be? Right? So the halacha, Rachmil is good, he's saying leave it all. He's a tzaddik, right? I would have said a little bit differently. I would have said, right? What are you talking about? Ani, you say I have your leket, great, prove it. Right? The onus is on you, Ani, right? The onus is on you, right? You want to claim that your leket is mixed in with my stuff, then fine, you have the obligation to prove. Let's say again.
It's allowed.
I'm sorry?
It's allowed.
Even if it's allowed, still again, to prove the amount. Right? This is mammon. The halacha is, I can't take it, fine. I'm not saying, but prove it. I'm just pointing out over here that the halacha clearly is not earning. The halacha is shifting to the side of the ani, and clearly again, making me set aside this entire amount of leket for the ani. So the only machlokes of Osai is, do we assess this field on its own, or do we give some objective measure of 4 kav per core? That's the only machlokes. We'll say, let's all right, you know what? We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick it to the Mishnah tomorrow. I will say also a special mazel tov to the Rotenbergs, who had twin grandsons in Yerushalayim. Mazel tov. I shut that down.